screen share for a second? Roger, can you stop your screen share?
Yeah.
There we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Marine Museum's Nautical Nights Autumn mini-series. I apologize for the delay, a few technical issues on our end, but I hope you're all well, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. So, as some of you may know, the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston is located in Kingston, Ontario, and I say this because we have some people joining us from all over the country tonight, so I'm very, very grateful for that. The Nautical Nights series is generally held over the winter, but given COVID last winter, we decided to hold a mini series in the autumn. And this particular one is going to be featuring our Forged in Fire Kingston Goes to Sea project, which was established to commemorate the end of the Battle of Atlantic 75 years ago, as well as the Second World War. And I mean, the mission of the Marine Museum is very much to connect the public with the maritime heritage of Kingston and the Great Lakes. And a huge part of that heritage are the ships that were built in Kingston and the men and women who served from Kingston and the surrounding area and Canada's Royal Canadian Navy. So just a couple housekeeping aspects to start. If you would like to contribute to the chat function, you should be able to do that on YouTube. If you aren't able to access that, you're very welcome to send out any questions that you have throughout the presentation to marmuse@marmuseum.ca, and I will put that email address in the chat, so you should see that pop up. The Autumn Mini Series, as I said, was set up to feature the Forged in Fire Kingston Goes to Sea project, which was set up in collaboration with the RMC Museum in Kingston. Nautical Nights is also in partnership with the Kingston Yacht Club, and so we're very grateful for them to have hosted us all these years. And very grateful to have Roger Litwiller joining us this evening to share Kingston's Fighting Corvette story. It's a very important local story in Kingston, and it's one it can be applied to numerous communities all across Canada in their effort to contribute to the Second World War. Roger Litwiller is a historian and published author of Canadian and naval maritime history, lecturing across Canada. He's a retired paramedic with 37 years of service, and he was awarded the Exemplary Service Medal and the Ontario Award for Paramedic Bravery. Well done, Roger. He's currently the historian for the Canadian Coast Guard. And so I asked Roger to join us here, and he will be sharing his screen momentarily. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate the intro. Many of you know me from my paramedic past, and others know me for my writing of naval history, and some know me as the historian for the Coast Guard. So when I go out and speak, I bill myself, I'm the storyteller who can save your life. So, and with this lecture, unfortunately, I am doing it live, but it's being broadcast separately on YouTube. So I won't get any reactions because that comment usually gets a few laughs. So I'm just going blind here that somebody's actually chuckling right now. On that note, I don't know who all is attending the session tonight. So a general welcome to everybody. Everybody's VIPs tonight because that's just the way things work. You know, if you're here, this is good stuff. You know, I'm really glad everybody's participating. So tonight, I'm going to talk about the Corvettes that were built here in Kingston. And I'm going to do a share screen. Make sure I get the right screen. And how's that? I'm assuming I got the thumbs up. That's what I like to see. So Kingston's Fighting Corvettes. And I always get a bit of a curiosity. What do you mean Kingston was fighting during the Second World War? Well, the Battle of Atlantic, yes, it was fought out on the Atlantic, but that was not the only place it was fought. It was fought in the St. Lawrence River, the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It was fought all along the eastern seaboard of North America, the Caribbean. It was fought right across the Atlantic to Europe. It was fought in UK waters, and Canadians were also fighting in ships in the Mediterranean, in the Arctic, and even on the Pacific. So when we talk about World War II and the Canadian Navy, it really was a battle that was fought everywhere. But that's just the water portion. To actually build the ships and supply the ships and recruit the men to sail, not just in the warships, but also in the merchant ships, Canadians had to come forward in huge numbers. And volunteers right from Newfoundland right through to Grand Prairie served in the Navy. And over 100,000 sailors joined the Navy. And not just men. And that's why I say sailors. It wasn't just men, it was men and women that were joining the Navy. But that just got the ships, and it got them crews, and it got them a battleground to fight on. But the reason why the fight was going on out on the Atlantic and across the ocean is England was alone. They needed to be supplied. And guess where their supplies were coming from? For the majority, well, the beginning of the war, all those supplies had to come from Canada. They came from ports in Halifax and St. John's and Sydney and Montreal and Quebec City and Toronto and Thunder Bay, all through the Great Lakes. Merchant ships were moving out to the Atlantic, including Lakers that were built here on the Great Lakes, and crossing the Atlantic with everything from bullets to Band-Aids. Those all had to come from factories. They had to come from farms. They had to come from industries, businesses. Every aspect of Canada was thrown into the Battle of Atlantic. And that's the prelude to this story. So to build all these ships, and Canada ended the war with 400 ships, we had to move to building ships wherever we could. And Kingston was one of those places. And Kingston had a long history of building ships. But warships was something new. Modern warships was something new. And in the First World War, Kingston stepped up and they built 6 minesweeping trawlers and 2 battle class trawlers for the Royal Canadian Navy. During the Second World War, Kingston Shipyards built 12 corvettes and 2 Western Isle trawlers. Now, out of those corvettes, 9 of them were used by the RCN. The remainder went to the Royal Navy and also the United States Navy, which is kind of ironic because Kingston's shipbuilding history in the early 1800s, she was building warships to fight the Americans. And now, just over 100 years later, she's building warships as an ally with the Americans. So times change. So we're going to talk about the Canadian corvettes tonight, because if we try to do a detailed account on all the corvettes that were built, this lecture would either be many, many sessions or very, very long. And we'll skip the long. If I get invited back for more sessions, that's good too. So the first corvette that came out of the shipyards was Napanee. And she was one of the early Flower class corvettes. The dates are on there for laid down, launched, commissioned, and paid off. I'll let you read those yourself. But she was the first corvette built in Kingston. And on her launching, Angus MacDonald, the minister, was there for the ceremony of the christening. And as soon as the ship slipped the ways and was in the water, he immediately turned back to where Napanee had just moved off the slip. And a keel laying ceremony was immediately begun for the next corvette, which was to be Prescott. And it's the first time in Canadian shipbuilding history that a ship was launched and a keel laid in the same spot at the same time. It was really quite an astounding feat of shipbuilding. Now, Napanee, she finished her building, almost finished her building, and on 30 November 1940, she was sent out to Montreal because the ice was coming in and they were going to finish the build out in Montreal so that she could beat the ice out to the Atlantic. Unfortunately, as she was going through the Morrisburg Canal in the St. Lawrence, just to the east of the city, she grounded. Grounding was severe enough that she had to return to Kingston for repairs, ended up getting caught in the winter ice on Lake Ontario, and therefore did not make it out to be officially commissioned until May 1941. Prior to her grounding, Napanee was going to be the very first corvette commissioned into the RCF. But with that delay, that honor went to HMCS Collingwood, which became the first corvette commissioned in the RCF. Now, Napanee had a very glorious history. She was, again, one of the first corvettes built. So therefore, she has one of the longest serving careers in the Navy and did quite a few things. She was one of the participants in the battle for convoy ONS 154 over Christmas and New Year's in 1942. 6 escorts, the destroyer St. Laurent, and then corvettes Battleford, Chilliwack, Napanee, Shadiac, and Kenegami were escorting 42 merchant ships across the Atlantic when they were attacked by 23 U-boats over a course of a 7-day continuous running battle across the Atlantic. 14 merchant ships were lost. Another one was damaged. 551 merchant sailors were killed in that battle. Another 564 survivors were rescued. And the battle was so intense, one of the German submarine commanders actually took one of the merchant skippers as prisoner back with him to Germany. In the middle of the battle, they had the resources to stop and take prisoners. In that battle, Napanee destroyed her first U-boat. She shared in the sinking of U-356. And then later on in the war, she destroyed in another U-boat and shared that again with Prescott. So here you have Prescott and Napanee sharing the same slip during launch and keel laying, but later on, they're actually chummy ships fighting the war together. Now, in her career, she did 64 Atlantic convoys, and she also supported convoys to the Mediterranean, but never entered the Mediterranean. So you see in her battle honors on the screen, her only battle honor is Atlantic 1941 to 1945. And Atlantic only is probably a very wrong way to phrase it, because that puts Napanee in the height and the very darkest days of the Battle of Atlantic. So a truly historic ship. Now we move on to Prescott. Prescott, also one of the early Flower class corvettes. And in this picture, you actually see her during completion at Kingston. So you can see her aft gun is missing and the searchlight is missing. So she's not quite done and still not in commission. Also had a very distinguished career, as you can see in her battle honors: Atlantic, North Africa, Gulf of St. Lawrence, Normandy, and English Channel. So she was part of Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. She was part of the Normandy invasion, Operation Overlord and Neptune. Truly a magnificent service. She did a total of 59 Atlantic and Mediterranean convoys, and that included one right all the way to Egypt. And she did attack and sink the one submarine, U-163, and with Napanee. Now, her fate was she was eventually broken up. After the war, she was decommissioned and broken up in Spain and sold for scrap. And now we move on to Sudbury. And again, Sudbury was an early war Flower class corvette. And in this picture, you see her later in life when she's had her forecastle extension. And that's where the main deck the forecastle forward deck is extended all the way back to the superstructure. She was the last of the short forecastle corvettes built at Kingston. She did 33 convoys in the North Atlantic and also to Guantanamo in the almost to the Caribbean. And she is the only corvette to have operated on both the East and the West Coast during the Second World War. In February, she was sent over to Esquimalt, where she commenced her forecastle extension, and then following the refit, she finished the war patrolling the Pacific off British Columbia. And after the war, she was sold and converted to a salvage tug, and she carried on in that capacity until 1967, when she was broken up for scrap in Victoria. So a very longevity career for this ship. And now we move to Charlottetown, and she was a revised Flower class corvette. And most people think of the corvettes as all one class, Flower class, but actually there were 4 different variations. So the short forecastle or plain Flower class corvette, revised Flower class corvette, which was built right from the builder's yards with the forecastle extension already in place. And then you have the increased endurance, which had the lengthened forecastle, but was capable of traveling a further distance. And then the final class was the Castle class. So Charlottetown, very famous ship. She initially escorted convoys on the North Atlantic, and then she was transferred to the Gulf Escort Force due to increased U-boat activity in the St. Lawrence. And the St. Lawrence became a very highly contested battleground during the war. Many ships were actually sunk, many lives lost, and it's a story that really needs to be told more often. And that again would be another session of the lecture that if the museum ever wants to have me back after today. She did more than 15 Atlantic convoys and several St. Lawrence convoys. And tragically, on the night or during the day of 11 September 1942, Charlottetown with a sister, Clayoquot, was returning to Gaspé after delivering a convoy called SQ-35, and the SQ stands for Sydney to Quebec. Sydney, Cape Breton to Quebec convoy number 35, the 35th convoy, when Charlottetown was struck by 2 torpedoes from the German submarine U-517. And that was near Cape Chat in the St. Lawrence. She was so close to shore that people in the area watched from shore as Charlottetown took her final death blows. And she sank very, very quickly. And as her stern submerged, unfortunately, at least one of the depth charges that were secured to her stern detonated, causing a severe underwater explosion, which killed several of the survivors as they were trying to abandon their ship. Clayoquot immediately went on the attack, got a Aztec contact, launched depth charges, tried to destroy the submarine, but in the process of the attack had knocked out her own radio. So she did not report Charlottetown sinking until some 2 hours after the attack had happened and Charlottetown was gone. The lighthouse keeper at Cape Chat was actually the first to report the attack to the Royal Canadian Navy, having witnessed the entire event from his lighthouse. Clayoquot then went to pick up 54 survivors, including 13 wounded. Sadly, 4 would die after the attack, and 4 were killed during the attack. So nine killed all total. Very sad event. Canadian Navy commemorated Charlottetown's name by using the name again in a River-class frigate that was built and served for the remainder of the Second World War. And to continue that honor, there currently is a Halifax-class frigate that bears that name, that is in service with the RCN and active, very active on Canada's West Coast. And here we have Frontenac. And Frontenac is the first of the increased endurance flower class corvettes. Name was selected prior to construction, as all ships' names are. And they wanted to honor Kingston with the name, but could not use the name Kingston. The reason being the Royal Navy already had a destroyer named HMS Kingston. So they decided to use an alternate name, and that alternate name became Frontenac, which is a name well associated with the community of Kingston. Unfortunately, the destroyer Kingston was torpedoed or bombed in an air attack at Malta and lost prior to Kingston being commissioned. So the name was freed up, but by then the king had approved the name Frontenac, and nobody goes and tells the king that, sorry, we changed our minds. She did make several convoy escorts throughout the North Atlantic, 17 convoys in total. And at the end of the war, she was sold to a New York company and was actually still in service with that company until 1957 and converted for merchant service. And now we have Trentonian. And I should mention the paintings that I'm using tonight are all from an artist here in Quinte West by the name of Mark McGee. Phenomenal maritime artist. He has some of the best paintings that I have ever had the pleasure to see. So this is Trentonian. Again, the name was to honor the community of Trenton, but Trenton could not be used because the Americans had a cruiser by that name. So the Navy selected Trentonia and compiled a list to be sent to the king of new ship names, and of which was approved by the king. And when they got the document back, they realized that the clerk, in typing the name Trentonia out, was preceded by the corvette named Prestonian, and the clerk had accidentally added an N to Trentonia. And again, nobody was going to tell the king that he signed a mistake. So the name Trentonian stuck. So, and Trentonian did 18 North Atlantic convoys. One of the things to note during her christening ceremony, the mayor of Trenton, his wife, was selected to conduct a christening ceremony. And as the ship began to slip, she launched the champagne bottle, but not having quite the strength that was needed, the champagne bottle almost made it to the hull of the ship and then swung immediately back, at which point one of the workmen grabbed the bottle of champagne, yanked it off the ribbon, and forcibly threw it against Trentonian's hull, shattering all over the place. Unfortunately, Trentonian was already in the water by the time he got the bottle against her hull. So we'll go into more details on Trentonian in the second part of the lecture. So now we have Peterborough. And you notice all these ships are named after communities. And many of you will know this, but some will not. Canadian Navy built 400 ships during the war. They had the money to build the ships. They had the people recruited to make up the ship's company. They had the equipment to fight the ships, but the money just was not there to make the ships homes. And for every sailor knows, you live in a ship, not on a ship. And therefore that ship is your home. It's also your flighting platform. It's also your lifeline. But first, it is your home. So the Navy got the great idea. Why don't we call these ships, give them names over after communities in Canada, and we'll get those communities to provide all the things that the sailors need. And they did in droves. They provided washing machines, blankets, games, magazines, cigarettes, you name it. The community stepped up and provided our Navy with all the things that they needed. So Peterborough, named after Peterborough, Ontario. She was a mid-ocean escort. She was part of the last convoy to leave last convoy to leave Halifax after the war ended. The convoys continued for several weeks after the war, just in case the German U-boats had not understood the surrender message. So on June 27th, she left Halifax with convoy HX 358, a very large convoy with several Canadian ships escorting, destroyers, corvettes. And the following day, the convoy received the message, resume normal navigation. Now, for almost 6 years, they had been traveling the Atlantic in absolute darkness. No lights on, absolutely blacked out ships. And then all of a sudden, with one radio message, every light in the convoy was on. And that suddenly became a massive, almost like a city, a massive city traveling across the ocean in one giant rectangle with all these corvettes and destroyers around the outside, lights burning fiercely. Just imagine the joy in those ships knowing it really is over. So she did 14 convoys across the Atlantic before the war ended. She was sold to the Dominican Republic and served in their Navy as Geraldo Jansen, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, and remained in service with them until she was broken up in 1972. A very long career for this ship. Belleville, named for Belleville, Ontario. She was plagued with engine problems right from the start of her commission, and which delayed her actually starting to actively fight in the war. So even though she was commissioned in October 44, there was still quite a bit of war left. She didn't actually start escorting convoys until much later, but she did manage to escort 3 convoys across the Atlantic by the time the war ended. One of those convoys, she had lost her radar, which was not uncommon for the type of radar sets that they had. And she also lost her ASDIC, which is what we call sonar now. And so she was blind. She couldn't see under the water. She couldn't see above the water. So line of sight was her only way of fighting the U-boats. The convoy did come under attack, and one of the merchant ships nearby was torpedoed. And Belleville, of course, went attempting to locate the submarine, and one of her lookouts spotted a periscope. Belleville goes in for the attack, drops depth charges, runs out to the other side, turns around, and lo and behold, there's a periscope again, almost in the same spot. Runs back in, drops depth charges again. And you got to remember, these poor guys are fighting with just line of sight, what they can see in the dark, right? So come across up to the periscope again, it doesn't dive. They run in, they drop their depth charges, run out, turn around. The periscope's still there. It wasn't until they got closer and took a really good look. It was actually a very large seabird that kept diving when they came in, swimming off, coming back up again, and was never bothered by the depth charge. So bit of a funny story. And again, this is Mark McGee's painting, and he kind of reflects that story when he painted this, but he did put a periscope in the painting for the sake of the ship. Now, fortunately, the merchant ship that was torpedoed was not damaged or was not sunk, but was heavily damaged. So Belleville, unable to be on the offensive, to make the attack, was assigned the task of towing this freighter into port. So they managed to get a tow line on board. Unfortunately, that line separated several times. And so they decided to bring Belleville alongside the freighter and actually secure her directly alongside, and she would motor her in that way. When they got alongside the freighter and called up to the deck for lines to be passed down, they didn't get any response. So after some very loud calls and a little bit of threatening to put an armed party on board, the master of the freighter and several of his crew leaned over the rail, quite plastered. Apparently, they had decided to toast their good fortune of still being alive and got drunk. So, after threats, the sailors on board the merchant ship managed to pass a line over, several lines over. They got Belleville secured, started making their way into port. It was a difficult tow because, this is a corvette towing a 10,000 ton merchant ship. And, but they did get her into harbor. The line did separate again. Belleville had to be reattached. And this time the crew on board the merchant ship were in no shape to do it themselves. So sailors from Belleville had to board the ship, secure the lines. They got her into a safe anchorage, shallow anchorage in the port in the UK, and dropped the anchor, released Belleville. Belleville started to sail away, and as Belleville did, the tanker sank. And fortunately, it was in shallow water, so it basically settled on the bottom, and the decks were still above. So even though she had a short career, she had a very interesting one. So post-war, Belleville also was sold to the Dominican Republic for their Navy and renamed Cologne. And she served until 1978. And in fact, she was being investigated after she was taken out of service by the Dominican Navy as a possibility of being returned to Canada as a potential museum ship to celebrate the history of the Corvettes in Canada. Unfortunately, before that decision could be made, she was wrecked in a hurricane a few months later. And as we all know, Sackville is now that Corvette that is truly a gem for all of Canada to celebrate. And Smith Falls. So Smith Falls entered the service very late in the war, November of 44. She too managed to escort 3 Atlantic convoys. And she was sold for conversion to a whaler at the end of the war, and she was still in Lloyd's register as an active ship up until 1978. She was the last corvette to be built at Kingston. And what is also interesting is not only the last corvette to be built in Kingston, but the last of all the corvettes to enter service with the RCN in Canada. So out of all the corvettes built in Lake Ontario and the Great Lakes, the East Coast, the St. Lawrence, the West Coast, she was the last to enter service. So Kingston Shipyards built those 12 corvettes, but that actually wasn't the end of the contract. There were contracts to build 2 more of the increased endurance corvettes. And when those 2 were done, there were contracts to build 6 of the Castle class corvettes. Fortunately for everybody, the war ended. Unfortunately for Kingston Shipyards, those contracts to build those additional ships were canceled. So that was the end of corvette building for Kingston. Now, yeah. So now we'll get into the second half, and that is the story of Trentonian. So I'm not going to throw a lot of dates and facts and figures at you because quite honestly, you can read those in books, and to sit there and listen to them, it's really quite boring. So what I do, and this is where the storyteller in me comes out, I talk about the stories, okay? Because it's the stories that we remember. Dates and times, facts and figures, they're great. Historians, academics, absolutely love them. But people just want to know the story. So this is Trentonian, and as you can see, that is a beautifully clean ship. She is brand spanking new. She's not yet commissioned. She's sitting off the docks at Kingston. She's undergoing her builder's trial. You know, she doesn't even have a rub on her hull yet. You know, so she's probably only left the dock. She has not come back to the dock for the first time because there's no rubs. She's gorgeous. And those men standing on the forecastle and some on the bridge, if you can see a closer view of that, you will see not all of them are wearing sailors' caps. Some are wearing bowlers, some are wearing other caps. So, you know, that's a combination of RCN sailors and dockyard workers taking out for a first good run on Lake Ontario. So when we talk about our sailors, and this is Trentonian Ships Company, this is what we normally think of. You know, sailors in their dress uniforms, all lined up, everybody's smiling and grinning. You know, this is a ship's company photo. It was taken in January 44 in Halifax. And the photo's not blurry. Those little white streaks that you see, it was a snowstorm the day they took the picture. So, and again, everybody's out there, no gray coats on. You know, those grins are like literally under between the clenched teeth. Hurry up and take the picture, right? Now, replace those dress uniforms with these guys. These guys are what sailors are all about. They're not dressed in their dress uniforms. No two guys are wearing the same thing. These are also the sailors that served in Trentonian, but these smiles are genuine. This is what these guys were like. And when we talk about our veterans and tell their stories, these are really the guys that we're talking about, right? But look at the age of these guys. You know, we think of our veterans as senior gentlemen and senior ladies. No, they were kids. They were 17, 18, 19. If you were 24, you were called pops. So one of the stories when I wrote my book, White Ensign Flying, I managed to track down 30 of the men that served in the ship and interview them in one form or another. And I had my list of questions, you know, and a lot of times they would start off, yeah, I was there, but, you know, it was going on 60 years ago and I don't know what I could tell you. And I would say, okay, I'm not interested in dates and times. I got those out of the archives. Tell me what your mates were like. Tell me what convoy duty was like. Tell me what shore leave was like. And one of the questions I always asked was, what was the food like? And everybody sees things differently, and most stories have their own personal account to it. But when it came to that question on food, it was almost a universal answer. Well, the food wasn't bad. You know, we could eat it. The cooks, they tried. They'd never cooked before. They tried. But we always had the same meal over and over again. And that was red lead and bacon. And for those that don't know, red lead is stewed tomatoes served with fried bacon in a bowl, usually with some hardtack because the bread would be too far gone, right? And that was a staple for them on board Trenton. Now, in the course of these interviews, I actually managed to come up and talk to one of the cooks. Now, I can't ask the cook what was the food like. So I asked him, tell me what you cooked for the guys. And he says, well, you know, I joined the Navy to fight the war. I never cooked a day in my life. After a couple of weeks and a little bit of training, I'm now cooking 3 meals a day for over 90 guys in the middle of the ocean. He says, I did what I could with what I had. He says, but there was one meal that I really, really liked. And he was actually out of Belle Island, Newfoundland. And I was talking to him from his home on the phone. He says, there's one meal that I really, really enjoyed. He says, I couldn't get enough of it. He says, in fact, I'm having it tonight for supper. He says, I just love that red lead and bacon. Now, a lot of the pictures you're going to see in the presentation tonight are all from this guy, Alan Singleton. He's from Saskatoon. He was a sick bay attendant, Tiffy, with Jack speak, naval slang. And the Tiffy on board a ship, unless somebody's hurt or sick, really doesn't have a lot to do. And he was an avid amateur photographer. And he managed to turn his sick bay into a dark room. So while everybody else was working, he would be going around with his little camera, taking photos, develop them in his sick bay, and then he would post them on the bulletin board, and he would make as many copies for the rest of the men in the ship for a few cents a piece. Somehow he had to buy his chemicals and his film, and the crew had the photos themselves. Sadly, and not giving away the end of the story because it's history, when Trentonian was lost, all his negatives went down with the ship. This is one of my favorite photos. This is Trentonian off the Grand Banks. And yes, that is fish laying on the deck. They had just delivered a submarine to St. John's. It was a Royal Navy submarine that had been damaged and couldn't dive. So Trentonian was sent out to find it and escort it into St. John's. Because the general order to all aircraft and ships was sink all submarines on sight. So even though it was an Allied submarine on the surface, if she was found, she was going to be sunk. So Trentonian escorted her safely into St. John's. They were just about to tie up alongside. The guys were looking forward to a run ashore. You know, the officers were probably looking forward to stopping at the crow's nest when the signal was flashed directly to the ship. Proceed immediately to Halifax without delay. So before they even got to throw the first heaving line, Trentonian secured from harbor stations and left harbor. Needless to say, there was about 90 upset people on board the ship. So as they were crossing the Grand Banks, the skipper came up on the bridge, walked over to the ASDIC repeater, the sonar display on the bridge, called the ASDIC operator and says, basically, you have an ASDIC contact. And the operator says, aye, sir, biological, meaning it's something living, you know, it's a school of fish or a whale or anything but a submarine. So the skipper says, very good, confirmed biological. ASDIC operator, of course, comes back, yes, sir, or aye, sir, confirmed biological contact. Next thing they know, the skipper is ringing up action stations and everybody's scrambling to their positions on the guns, the depth charge throwers, depth charge rails, damage control parties. Everybody's closing up. Revolutions are brought up on the engine. She races out. Skipper orders a 180-degree turn. She races back in and the skipper gives the order, fire one depth charge. Depth charge goes over the side. Trentonian races on. Big explosion astern. runs all the way out. Skipper orders another turn to 180 degrees, starts coming back into where they dropped the depth charge. And before they get there, the skipper orders all stop. And he stops the engines. Trentonian coasts, comes to a stop, and then the old man orders away boats. And boat's crew closes up. They jump in, boat's lowered, and off they go, pulling away from the ship. Now, several of the guys, especially the green sailors, what's the old man doing? He's stopping us in the middle of the Atlantic. There's submarines here. We're going to get killed. In the meantime, the guys from the Maritimes, they have their knives and their stones out, and they're sharpening up, right? Boat comes back a few minutes later, completely full with every type of fresh fish you can imagine. It was a bounty from the ocean. They unloaded the boat, secured, and away Trentonian go. The maritime guys, they're already cleaning the fish. They're getting all these nice fillets off. The cooks already have milk boiling on the stoves, and they make a chowder. And when I interviewed these men, it was another one of those stories that was absolutely remembered by all of them, and every one of them with those same grins that you saw in those pictures. They had a feast, they said, that will never be forgotten. Which brings me to the next story. And this is the contrasting life of a sailor, right? So this is Trentonian again, and this is Trentonian's forecastle. You can see the bull ring, and this is the anchor chain. And this is a work party. Again, no two guys dressed the same, right? Caps are certainly not squared for the two that are actually wearing caps. This guy right here, and hopefully you can see it. No, it's not coming up. Okay. Nope, my highlighter's not working. So the guy in the back on the left-hand side, he's wearing a Toronto Maple Leaf jersey. Now, Trentonian is secured alongside a wall here, and that's pretty rare for the corvettes during the war, especially in the UK. And this is in Milford Haven, because there was so little space alongside that priority was given to the ships that needed it. Everybody else had drop anchor secured to a buoy out in the harbor. So Trentonian is going through a boiler cleaning, so she needs to be alongside, and she's going to be alongside for 10 days. Where they secured her this is the fish processing plant. So the ship directly ahead and just off to her starboard side, those are fishing trawlers. And every day, all day, fishing trawlers would come up alongside the wall. They would unload their catch. And right there on the wall, the fish were gutted, headed, tailed, cleaned, and the fillets would move into the plant for processing. And as you can see on the ground on the wall, there's all sorts of bits there. Those are fish bits. And if you look at the roof of the processing plant, that is lined from one end to the other with seagulls. This is August 1944. The stench, and every one of them, again, another common memory, every one of them described the stench that they had to put up for 10 days in August. It permeated every space in the ship. And seafood was never served again in Trentonian. Now, I've mentioned her skipper several times. At the most of Trentonian's career was Bill Harrison from Nova Scotia. And he was described as very honest, very thoughtful skipper, excellent sailor, and generally took his sailors' well-being as a priority. Rarely displayed any anger. And again, This is one of those events that they all remember. This is Trentonian on the outboard and a large tanker inboard. And this is taken in Bermuda. Two of the officers in Trentonian were actually good friends prior to the war, both from Montreal. And you see the two of them on Trentonian's forecastle having a bit of a scuffle. But again, you know, they grew up together and routinely horsed around. So when they were in the UK, and this is middle of May 1944, they were finally given an opportunity to go ashore for leave. They had been in the UK for 2 weeks, but all of it had been spent under intensive training, including convoy training and anti-aircraft training. In fact, they brought 2 Spitfires in with Trentonian sailing in a straight line, and the 2 Spitfires raced down the Corvette sides, firing all guns into the water right alongside the ship, with the entire crew on deck so that they could witness what an air attack would actually be like. And so when they finally did get time to go ashore, they made good advantage of it. And these 2 officers were standing on the jetty waiting for a cab when the one reached up and grabbed the cap off the other's head, tucked it under his arm like a football, and went tearing down the jetty with his good friend chasing him, knowing full well that his good friend played semi-professional football at one point. So he didn't get very far, but he did get up enough speed that when his friend tackled him and brought him to the ground, the crew and all those that were there to witness it said there was a crack that was heard around the fleet, followed by a scream that was heard in every ship as the young officer's femur broke in 2. And there he laid on the jetty with a broken femur and screaming in pain as an ambulance was called and taken away. Once the ambulance left, the skipper, Harrison, sent for the other officer to his cabin, and the crew related they had never heard the skipper that angry before. He was literally reaming this young officer like they had never heard anybody do before. And they were hearing coming from the skipper's cabins words like, you're going to have us killed. You've endangered this entire ship. Every one of us is now has a chance that they could die. And this is not a conversation you would normally hear. What nobody had realized at the time was they were just a few days away from leaving for the Normandy invasion. The young officer that had broken his leg was a navigator. And while the ship's companies had spent 2 weeks training for the invasion that they didn't know about, the navigator had spent 2 weeks learning all the ship's movements and positions during the battle that was to come and committing it to memory. So now they had to train a new navigator in 2 days before they left port. So this is one of the fellows I interviewed. His name's Jack Harold from Aurora, Ontario. And Jack kept a diary. And he was very kind enough to lend it to me. And I used a lot of it in my book because it was written as events were occurring. So I'm going to read a letter or an entry that he had put in his diary on June 4th, 1944. The old man called the crew together for a pep talk on what is about to happen. I'm going to have a ringside seat to the biggest thing in warfare that man has ever conceived or attempted. We are now in the English Channel, shepherding our convoy like a big wandering flock of sheep under the watchful eye of British fighter and bomber aircraft. This strip of water will in a day or two, without a doubt, become the hottest spot on earth, and I shall be at the very vortex of this man-made hell. In case I do not survive, perhaps someday someone will say he died doing his duty. It has been estimated that 85% of the men taking part in this invasion will not come out of it, while everyone is hoping that he will be one of the 15% that is left, but also resolved to go down fighting if he is not. Jack was 21 when he wrote that. I didn't have to deal with stuff like that when I was 21. Jack survived. And this is what Trentonian went into. And these are pictures taken by Singleton from Trentonian's decks in the Normandy invasion beaches. And they're absolutely wonderful. We see lots of pictures taken of the shore and inland. Rarely do we see the photos of what had to happen to get all those soldiers onto the beaches. Another sailor I interviewed was Bruce Keir out of Scarborough, and he related to a story to me. After they delivered their convoys to the beachheads, they were anchored, and while they were anchored, this troop ship, and when I say this troop ship, I mean this troop ship, because this picture was taken from Trentonian, steamed past them. Her decks were completely filled with soldiers. When the soldiers on board saw Trentonian's make-believe painted on their funnel, they started to cheer. The men in Trentonian, up on deck watching all the activity around them, started to cheer back. Within a few minutes, though, the guys in Trentonian realized the soldiers were cheering in French, and the guys on the troop ship realized the guys in Trentonian were cheering in English, and the cheers changed to jeers. You know, friendly banter between the French-Canadian soldiers and the RCN sailors. Happens all the time, whether it's French and English or, you know, it just has to be soldiers and sailors. It's all that's needed. And then all of a sudden, the troop ship stopped, dropped anchor, almost right alongside Trentonian. And the landing craft came up. The soldiers started clambering into the boats, and he's describing a beehive of activity. You know, alarms are going off in the troop ship, signaling the soldiers to come up. You know, the landing craft are banging against the hull, you know, in the ripples and the swells of the sea. You know, so you have steel crashing on steel. Sailors are clambering down the cargo nets. Some of them are not making it all the way down and fall into the landing craft. At the same time, you know, because they are out, you know, with a good swell, the landing craft will go one way, the troop ship will go another way, and then back again, and soldiers on the cargo nets will be slammed against the solid steel wall of the troop ship. You know, so there's cursing and swearing, and the diesel motors of the landing craft. And as each one is filled, it moves off and stays close to the ship. And as all the landing craft are filled, they form a line and they start racing in towards the beaches. And the guys on Trentonian are watching this. You know, they're seeing all this activity, they're hearing all this noise. And as the engines start to rev up on the landing craft as they go to full revolution, the men in Trentonian standing on her deck, they give these French-Canadian soldiers one final cheer as they race into the beaches. And as the engines die away, as the landing craft get farther and farther away, the noise starts to drop. And they look back at the troop ship, all the commotion that was going on with all these soldiers scrambling to get off. It's now become literally bobbing empty on its anchor chain. And there's silence. And one of the Trentonians turns to one of the others and says, I wonder how many of those poor buggers will be alive by sunset. This is the cable ship Monarch. And this was another major event that Trentonian was involved in. And I'm going to have to speed up here. I'm running a little bit late. Monarch was a cable laying ship, and she was on a secret mission to lay a communication cable across the English Channel to the beachhead. And Trentonian was given the task to escort her. When on the night of the 12th of June, Trentonian and the cable layer suddenly came under heavy gunfire. And the fire was about 5 minutes in length. It was estimated 80 rounds of 5-inch ammunition was fired at the two ships. Fortunately, none of it hit Trentonian, but Trentonian skipper Harrison managed to get the gunfire stopped by turning on every light in the ship and placing Trentonian between the attacker and the cable layer, and the attacker finally checked fire. And that's Monarch after the attack. You can see her entire upper works are carried away. Her bridge is completely smashed. The cable that she was laying was lost to the ocean. This is a little closer view. You can see the splinter damage. That's the radio shack on Monarch. Many wounded. Sadly, the attacker was an American destroyer, USS Plunkett, that thought Trentonian and the cable layer were enemy ships. So I'm just going to skip a couple of these. And again, another one of the collectives, stories from the men. Trentonian was 49 days of continuous duty around the Normandy invasion. No time at port, no time ashore, constantly escorting convoys from the UK to the beachhead. So after a while, the crew started to get a little exhausted. So they came up with a plan. They kind of hid the rum ration for a few days. They shredded every newspaper and magazine they had in the ship. They threw a mop head on one of the sailors. Another one of the sailors got out the good book of seamanship, and using a bearing from one of the engineers on the ship, they created a ring. And standing on the 4-inch gun platform directly below the bridge of Trentonian, they conducted a mock wedding, marrying off one of the sailors to one of the others. At the end of the ceremony, they broke out the newspaper confetti and the rum ration that they had been sitting on for a few days. And the entire off-watch portion of the ship's company got absolutely toasted on the forward deck. And it was a blast. And you can tell by the little smiles, they are having a great time. Well, it worked, because as soon as Trentonian got to port, the entire crew was given shore leave to get ashore. Some spent that in London. Others, like these three gentlemen, spent pub hopping. And Tom Farrell would act as an MC. They would go into a bar. Tom would approach the barkeeper. Would you like some entertainment tonight? And in exchange for some drinks. So Tom would MC, Eric Muff, and you can tell he's a character. He would be the comedian, and Phil Kevins would play the piano and sing. And all three of them said they never bought a beer the entire time they were in the UK. And some came back from shore leave, unfortunately, not feeling quite so well. So, coming to this picture. This photo here is one of my most favorite and most hated photos of Trentonian. It is an amazing photo. She's on a little bit of a heel. She's obviously in a swell, but she's heeled over enough. You can actually see into the ship. You can see the men standing on the forward gun deck. You can see everybody that's working the bridge up top. You can see the men in the gun tubs and in the stern and on the quarterdeck. This is a ship escorting a convoy and ready to do battle. That's what I love about it. But the caption says 22 February off Land's End. Now, the skipper, and there was a new skipper by this time, Colin Glasgow. His documents on this day are very, very specific, right down to the minute. At 10:30 in the morning, fog lifted. The ship had been in fog all day up until then. She was escorting a convoy into the English Channel. So this had to happen after 10:30 in the morning. Well, just after 12 that same day, one torpedo struck Trentonian, right where you see those two sets of X's on her stern, and blew a gaping hole right into that part. So within an hour and a half of this photo being taken, all the men in this ship, their lives are about to change. For 6 of those men, their lives suddenly ended. And for 14 of those men, and several of them critically, they were wounded. But in this picture, they don't know that's about to happen to them. And these are the men that were lost that day. Now, Wells, the first one on the top row, he died of illness prior to Trentonian being lost. But the other men were all killed on that day. Moyle Beck, Robert Catherine, John Fournier, Colin Harvey, John McCormick, and Gordon Stephen. McCormick, and you can see how young these men are. McCormick is from Belleville, Ontario. When Trentonian was commissioned, he was standing dockside as a sea cadet as part of the celebratory party. You imagine the joy he had being assigned to the ship that he was there to see start its career, only to be lost when that ship was torpedoed. This is a painting of Trentonian that Mark McGee did. It now hangs in the library in Trenton for everybody to see. And if you ever get a chance to get to Trenton, it's well worth going into the library just to see this painting. It is stunning. The shipyard. Post-war, Kingston Shipbuilding continued to build for several years after the war. The shipyard still did build one more ship for the RCN, the Bay-class minesweeper HMCS Resolute, and she was in service from 1954 to 1964. And also in that construction were some a ship that was built for the RCMP, Fort Steele, and she was later turned over to the RCN as a training ship for reserves. And this is a picture I took last year of HMCS St. John's anchored just off the museum. It was a good day for ship watching. Kingston, the community continues a strong relationship, not just with ship visits on Great Lake deployments, but the name Kingston lives on in the maritime coastal defense vessel Kingston. And this is on one of her visits in 2013. And every day, Kingston has a strong community relationship with the Naval Reserve Unit, HMCS Cataraqui. But shipbuilding in Kingston, that is a magnificent story all on its own. You can trace back the shipbuilding in Kingston right back to the time of LaSalle in 1676, building bateaus, gun bateaus for the French to fight the English. And then later on, great big men of war, the St. Lawrence, built to fight the Americans. First World War, Second World War, merchant ships during all that time. And the shipbuilding continues today with Metalcraft Marine on the Inner Harbor. And one of their recent big contracts was building the Bay class search and rescue lifeboats for the Canadian Coast Guard. And this is Cape Mercy, one of the boats that was built in Kingston, just off the harbor in Coburg. And so Kingston, it's now 344 years of shipbuilding history and still going strong. That is a legacy that all of us can be very, very proud with. So that pretty much brings me to the end of the lecture today, only about 15 minutes long. If you want to learn more about Trentonian, my book, White Ensign Flying, is all about her. If you want to learn more about the ships built in Kingston, some of the ships built in Kingston, but all of the ships built and named for the Quinte area in Ontario, my book, Warships of the Bay of Quinte. And if you enjoy naval history, I do posts every morning on my social media, on Facebook and Twitter, and blogs and daily posts on my website at rogerlitwiller.com. Please feel free to follow. If you're already a follower, I really appreciate the support that everybody has given me. And please feel free to comment on any posts that you see. Now, Michelle is going to pass on the questions and comments to me, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Roger. That was a wonderful presentation. We've been trying for the past, nearly the past year to try and tell that story of Kingston's contribution to the Second World War. And I think you summed it up very, very well this evening. And so I thank you so much for that. And not just that, but to simply say you're hearing about the stories from the Trentonians' perspective going into D-Day, and even just talking about the 85%. I could speak personally, having a great uncle who unfortunately was part of that 85%. And so it was really touching to hear about that perspective and for you to be able to share those personal anecdotes and the stories. It's exactly what we're trying to tell here. And so thank you so much for that. So I'm going to switch it back to, let's see here if we have any comments come in. We had a lot of people commenting throughout, just saying like where they're from. We have some a real Brisson from, apologies if I'm getting any names right, from Halifax, who I understand has worked with you in terms of the Battle of Atlantic 75th commemorations.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. And we got here Comshare Brampton, although that's somebody trying to connect with somebody else. That's wonderful. People from Toronto. We have Barry Walker from the Naval Association. And Marie Smith, our curator emeritus at the museum, was talking about. He mentioned that Francis McLaughlin apparently was one of the gentlemen that ventured south, look at Belleville as a potential museum ship. So that's a great little tie-in that I didn't really know about. So that's wonderful. Yeah. Right. We go. And so people commented they really like the presentation. So that's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to double check the email side here. Do you have any other questions? Question from me. I guess you spoke a lot about the kind of the connections from Trentonian. I understand that's most likely because of the research you did specifically on Trentonian. Were you stumbled upon any material like that from any of the other vessels?
Yes. When I write, I try and like I said earlier, dates, times, facts, and figures. They're great for academics and historians, but most people just want to hear the story, right? They're not interested in the day that things happened. They want to know what happened. So when I write, the dates, times, facts, and figures, they're in my books, but they're not the book. And I try and gather as much of the personal stories. And there's lots of ways you can do that, from, letters and newspaper clippings. It doesn't have to be one-on-one interviews. And so it's coming up with that, those stories. Same with the story of Belleville, depth charging the Seabird. That's not in the official record, right? That was given by one of their sailors that did a newspaper interview for a Remembrance Day service many years after, right? And so it's those are the interesting parts. Yeah. So I should mention about Trentonian, one other thing. If nobody has actually noticed beside me here all night, this incredible model of HMCS Trentonian is 1/72nd scale and was entirely hand built by a good friend of mine, Dave Innes. And he's loaned it to me for tonight on the promise that it is absolutely kept safe, because as soon as things reopen, it's going to the Marine Museum of Great Lakes as a donation. And he wants to make sure that it stays in good health until then. Oh, I've lost.
Thank you for, no, that's okay. Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you for taking care of it, Roger. I've had the opportunity to see some of the images from it, and I think it's one of those models where it most of them you see the kind of the pristine ship as soon as it's been launched or been commissioned. But this one, it's a bit more realistic, I think, in terms of portraying it. It really demonstrates after it's seen a few convoys, and I think that's great to see. I appreciate that. Thank you.
That brings us to the old adage: every sailor, whether it's today or in the past, knows the duty of chipping and scraping and painting. So.
Absolutely, and as we see, of course, from the images, there was never a short supply of that going on.
No.
So I have a few more comments here. Again, thank you so much from everybody participating, and believing that it's obviously right in time with Remembrance Day. So that's, of course, exactly why we timed it that way. So thank you. We got here involved in. There we go. General comments. Everyone really enjoyed it, so thank you. Just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions. I'll be sure to pass all of these comments on to you, Roger, but I don't see any more questions. If there are any that come in that I miss, I'll make sure. Oh, there we go. How much the original builder's yard is still available? Still visible. I take it referring to the Kingston Shipyards, where the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes is now we're going to be returning to. So I could mention that one. So the former Kingston Shipyards was the location of the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes until about 4 years ago, and change of ownership. But to sum it up, we're going to be moving back to that location. In terms of what's visible there still, it's primarily the buildings that were where the museum was, that were part of the shipbuilding company for over 100, nearly 100 years, part of which dates from the Second World War. The dry dock, which was built in 1890, is still there and was extended in 1929. And then, of course, where the actual ships, the corvettes that Roger's been speaking about, were launched on the West Pier. So you can see the West Pier. Unfortunately, you're not able to go on it. It's blocked off, but you're able to still walk around that area, and you can see from one perspective and the other, that whole location. And if you come to the Marine Museum, we can show you some images of the shipyards from the 1950s, and you'll get an idea of trying to contextualize it a bit more. So I hope that answered your question. I'll double check emails. There we go. And there we go. Yes, Marisa said part of the launching way is still visible on the west side of the pier. And if you're coming down kind of in behind the Pump House Museum in Kingston and walk east along the waterfront, you'll be able to see it. I think that's all the questions we have for now. So I'm going to zip back over here and really just say again, thank you so much, Roger, for joining us for our autumn mini series. And I know I speak for everyone who participated that we greatly appreciate your your history that you were able to share with today, and being able to commemorate the 75th anniversary. So thank you so much. For everyone who's listening, our next speaker night is with Sherry Pringle, whose presentation is called Extraordinary Women. And as you quite understand, it's going to be telling the story of the contributions of women in the Navy, apologies. And through that, we'll be focusing on the Kingston's the contribution of local women in the Royal Canadian Navy, specifically, of course, the Wrens, as we know them by. So I invite you to check out our web page for information about Sherry's presentation on the 18th of November, once again at 7 p.m. And for anyone who is interested in registering, again, the link to the event will be sent out when the registration closes at 5 p.m. on the day, hoping that your inbox doesn't get cluttered and so you don't lose the link to join the event. And that was my intention behind that. So in the meantime, stay well, stay safe, stay sane, and of course, stay connected. And I've shared Roger's website on the chat, so take a look at that. And take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
There we go. Roger,